Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and for the next 4 episodes, I am going to talk about how to engage another person's story. But before I begin, if the podcast has been helpful to you, please consider supporting it financially. The way you can do that is to go to my website and click on Support the Podcast. There are 3 different options for supporting the podcast. Thank you for considering it. Okay, over the next 4 episodes, I am going to share what I call the basic principles of story engagement and the tactics of story engagement. In other words, how to do it. Both listening to someone's story and responding well to someone's story is part art and part science. In other words, there are certain principles that apply, principles that can be taught. That's the science part. And then there is something that needs to be caught by watching others do it, and that's the art part. So, point number 1 of today's episode is that story engagement can be learned. It is not some mysterious ability that some people are born with and other people aren't. The notion that, Adam is good at this, but I never could be, is baloney. I sucked at story engagement when I first began this work in 2013. I had no idea where to start, what to focus on, what to say, what not to say. This is something that can be learned. Dan Allender says that only 2 things are required to begin engaging someone's story: humility and courage. Skill will eventually follow. Okay, that's an important quote from Dan. All you need to begin is humility and courage. And those are things that cannot be taught. But if you are growing in those 2 attributes, humility and courage, the rest can be taught. Now, before discussing the basic principles of story engagement, I want to talk a bit about the goal of engaging someone's story. The goal. Why do it? What's the point? I think of the goal of story engagement in terms of the 3 Christian categories of crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. And let me put it this way. I think that the goal of story engagement is grieving together, which is represented by the crucifixion, rejoicing together, represented by the resurrection, and reigning together, which is represented by the ascension. In other words, the goal of story engagement is connection. Connection. You connect with the storyteller as you grieve together, as you rejoice together, and as you talk about reigning together. Okay, I realize that's a little bit obtuse. What does all this mean practically? First, grieving together, crucifixion. Okay, as you engage someone's story, there has to be a growing sense of awe at the severity of what the boy or girl in the story suffered and endured. A growing sense of awe at the severity of the harm that was done to him or her. The goal is for both you and the storyteller to experience the grief of the harm done to the storyteller as a boy or girl. Many of you have some awful stories from your growing up years. Now consider that word awful. This is another insight from Dan Allender. When you look at that word awful, it's the word awe and the word full. Something that is awful should likewise fill us full of awe. As you engage with the storyteller, you want both of you to be increasingly filled with awe at the heartache that was suffered. Awe at what happened will naturally lead to grief and rage, both of which are necessary for healing to occur. So, the first purpose of story engagement is grieving together. Second purpose, rejoicing together, and this is represented by the resurrection. Just as there needs to be a growing sense of awe at the harm endured, there needs to be a growing sense of awe at the glory of the boy or girl in the story. And, moreover, there also needs to be a growing sense of awe at the glory that God created in the storyteller in the midst of trauma and in the aftermath of the trauma. I'll explain this in a minute. Rejoicing together refers to experiencing awe at the glory of the boy or girl in the story and the additional glory that God cultivated in that boy or girl in the midst of the trauma and in the aftermath of the trauma. Now, this is in no way to say, please hear this, this is in no way to say that God authored the trauma so that you might grow. Please, by no means. It is to say that as you look at people's stories, especially as you look at the patterns and themes that emerge in people's stories, you will see that the very stories of trauma and abuse have often resulted in the cultivation of even more glory, beauty in the storyteller. Rejoicing together is about having awe at the particular ways in which evil intended this person's trauma for destruction, and yet God cultivated goodness and glory in the very midst of said trauma and devastation. So, for example, one of my stories is about me as an 11-year-old boy looking my father in the eye as he unleashed a torrent of rage at me. And I have a sentence in there about how when he's raging at me, I looked at him and I looked him right in the eye. Now, if you're listening to this story, if you're engaging me about this story, and if you can put yourselves in the shoes of that 11-year-old boy looking his father in the eye, you will realize that that 11-year-old boy had immense courage in that moment. That courage needs to be named and celebrated. This is what it means to rejoice together. The closer you get to someone's story, the deeper you go into the core stories that make up their life, the more you will see how their wounds are becoming their weapons. In other words, the wounds that the storyteller suffered are becoming the weaponry that they are presently using on behalf of the goodness of the kingdom of God. So, the second purpose of story engagement is rejoicing together at, indeed, the glory of the boy or girl in the story. Third purpose of story engagement is reigning together, and this is represented by the ascension of Christ. What do I mean by reigning together? I mean that as you engage someone's story, there needs to be a growing desire in both you and the storyteller for the storyteller to use their glory and their weaponry on behalf of the kingdom of God. A growing desire to do that. Reigning refers to becoming fully yourself and doing the work on this earth that you were uniquely created to do. One of the goals of the work of Christ is to restore us to our rightful authority as kings and queens on the earth. And kings and queens reign. They use their gifting to rule over a particular kingdom. To reign together is to dream about how the storyteller can transform their wounding into weaponry on behalf of their kingdom. So, effective story engagement is intended to kindle desire in the storyteller, desire to say hell no to evil, and to say a hearty yes to becoming more fully who they are uniquely created and called to be. So, in summary, the goal of story engagement is to connect with the storyteller as you grieve together, rejoice together, and reign together. Okay, that was all prologue to what I want to focus on today. I want to take you through some of the core principles of effectively engaging another person's story. Imagine that you're sitting across from someone who has just read one of their stories to you. They have just read you a narrative of a particular scene of heartache, abuse, tragedy. What in the world do you say when they are done reading? Here are some principles that you can keep in mind. Principle number 1, attunement is more important than engaging their story brilliantly. Attunement is more important, this is the first principle, than engaging their story brilliantly. No matter how skilled or brilliant you are at engaging someone's story, if you are not attuned to what is happening inside the storyteller's body in the here and now, you are going to miss them. It's impossible to overstate the power of attunement when it comes to engaging someone's story. Now, what is attunement? To attune to someone is to pay attention to their nonverbal communication, facial expression and tone of voice, and to track their emotions and their bodily sensations. So attunement is about paying attention to the storyteller's nonverbal communication, that is their facial expression and their tone of voice, and as you do that, to track what the storyteller is feeling and what sensations they're having in their body. It is very common when you're engaging someone's story to focus all of your energy on the story itself and thinking about the story, and then miss what's happening for the storyteller right now as they are sitting across from you and talking with you. Now look, attunement does not mean you have to be a mind reader. You're allowed to ask questions like, what are you feeling in your body right now? That question will allow you to attune to the storyteller. Questions like, how is your heart after reading your story? All right, that's going to allow you to attune to the storyteller. These questions allow you to track with the storyteller's affect. The questions allow you to stay attuned to the storyteller's inner experience in the present moment. And this will make them feel felt, feel joined, feel like you care about how the story is affecting them in the present right now, rather than simply caring about, doing a good job engaging their story. So to say, I just noticed a shift in your facial expression. What are you feeling right now? What's happening for you right now? These inquiries communicate to the storyteller that you want to understand their present experience and that you are committed to being with them in their present experience. It's important to remember that the worst part of so many of the stories that you will hear is not the trauma itself. It is the fact that the storyteller was utterly alone in the midst of the trauma and utterly alone in the aftermath of the trauma. By being with them right now, you are giving the storyteller a taste of what it could have been like if someone was attuned to them when they were 9 and that bad thing had just happened. You're giving them a taste of that, an experience of that. As you begin to dialogue with the storyteller, as you begin to say some things and ask some questions, you have to be attuned to how your words and your presence are affecting the storyteller. You have to check in with them to see how they are experiencing you. You don't have to be Jesus and know what the storyteller is feeling and thinking. You can simply ask them, what are you feeling about what I just said? Or, I just used some pretty strong language there. How are you feeling about what I just said? Now, there are 2 keys to attuning to another person's inner experience. And those two keys are 1, paying attention to the storyteller's body, i.e. their nonverbal communication. And the second is paying attention to your body. I'll explain both. First, you have to watch someone's face very closely. The face never lies. And here's what I mean by that. As a professional actress, Reese Witherspoon has the ability to make her face look surprised when she is filming a scene. However, if Reese Witherspoon is genuinely surprised by something, she cannot make her face look bored. She cannot do that. Why? Because the 42 muscles of your face are connected to your nervous system. Therefore, when you feel surprise or shame or sorrow, your face automatically changes into a muscular configuration that displays the emotion you are feeling. Now look, you don't need to become a perfect face reader, okay? You don't need to know the particular facial muscles that contract when someone is sad versus when they're ashamed. You just need to notice when their facial muscles shift. Anytime someone's facial expression changes, or anytime their tone of voice shifts, something important and meaningful is happening inside of them. You want to know what that important and meaningful shift is. So you cannot attune to someone without paying attention to their face and their tone of voice. Secondly, you cannot attune to someone without knowing what's happening inside your own body. I know this sounds strange. Okay, let me unpack this. To engage someone's story well, you need to frequently check in with yourself and see what you are feeling emotionally as the other person is speaking. As the storyteller is telling you about how she was terrorized by her older sister growing up, how her older sister would pin her down and get on top of her and pound her back when she was only 7 years old, you need to feel in your body something of what the storyteller would have felt inside her 7-year-old body. And we all need to grow in this ability. We need to develop a portion of our brain called the anterior insula. There is a part of your brain called the insula. And the anterior portion of the insula is the part of your brain that is activated when you are aware of what is happening inside of your body, in your throat, your chest, your gut. This ability to be aware of the sensations inside your body is called interoception with an I, interoception. And interoception happens in your insula. Neuroscientist Dan Siegel says this. He says that the more interoception and insula activation, the more capacity we will have for tuning into others and being empathic of their experience. Isn't that fascinating? What's he saying? He's saying the more you are able to know what you are feeling inside of your own body, the more you will be able to empathize with the storyteller. So, as the storyteller narrates what happened, notice the feelings you have inside of your body. Do you find yourself feeling frantic inside? Is it difficult to breathe? Do you feel shame? Do you feel sorrow? At what part of the story do you feel most connected to the boy or girl in the story? These feelings, these bodily sensations that you have will give you clues about what the storyteller may be experiencing inside of themselves. So this next sentence might sound strange, but I don't know how else to say it. Good story engagement is more about attunement than about story engagement. All right, here's another quote from Dan Siegel. He says that we feel heard or seen by another person when we can detect that they have attuned to us and taken us inside their own mind. When we ourselves register this attunement, our own state can change. The observed takes in the observer, having taken her in, and the two become joined. That's Dan Siegel. Now, when this happens, when the storyteller is aware that you have taken them in, this is a moment of deep connection. You are made for that level of care and that level of intimacy. You are made to offer it, and you are made to receive it. Okay, that's principle number 1 of story engagement. Attunement is more important than engaging their story brilliantly. Principle number 2, kindness will take you further than skill. Kindness will take you further than skill. Now, when I say kindness, I don't mean being nice. I don't mean being merely a sweet and compassionate listening ear. Kindness is not niceness. Kindness requires humility and boldness. It requires, in other words, moving into terrain that most are too afraid to enter. Good story engagement starts in your gut. It starts with a guttural desire for the storyteller to experience freedom where they are bound. As you are taken inside the storyteller's world, you have to want things for them that they might not yet want for themselves. And kindness means being willing to suffer so that the storyteller might experience new levels of freedom. Kindness means having the courage to name, for example, that those sexually suggestive comments from Dad were not because Dad was clueless about how to interact socially. They were because your dad was aroused by your girlfriends when you brought them over. And Dad may have been aroused by you at times. Now, if you name that, if you take the risk of moving into terrain that most people are unwilling to enter, what is going to happen? Well, in this example, you're going to evoke the storyteller's shame. If you get close to the storyteller's shame, if you begin to name things in their story that they feel shame about, the storyteller might have contempt for you. In fact, it is likely that they will. Are you willing to suffer their contempt? Here's the dilemma with being kind, or at least one of the dilemmas. Your kindness will often evoke ambivalence in the storyteller. Ambivalence is feeling two contradictory things at the same time. When you are kind, the storyteller will want you to simultaneously move closer to them, because we all crave kindness, we all love it, and the storyteller will also at the same time push you away. Ambivalence is come closer, go away. Come closer, go away. Why might your kindness prompt the storyteller to push you away? Two reasons. Your kindness will likely do two things. First, it will connect them to their immense unmet need for kindness. They have just read a story about a boy or a girl who was unseen and abandoned and humiliated. They have likely not experienced many people who were genuinely attuned to them and responsive to them. They haven't had many experiences of attunement. Therefore, your kindness will trigger what's called the attachment circuitry in their brain. And the attachment circuitry simply refers to those portions of our brain that are designed to need another person, to connect to another person, to trust another person. That's what the attachment circuitry portions of the brain are all about. It's the parts of our brain that are designed to need another human being. Now, the storyteller has spent much of their life trying to not need other people. They have spent much of their life trying to convince themselves that they can do life alone because no one was ever there for them. And now, all of a sudden, someone, namely you, are there for them. You are listening to them. You are paying exquisite attention to them. You're there for them. It will feel agonizing for the storyteller to let themselves feel their longing for your care, their need for your care, their yearning for the kindness you are offering. All right, the second thing your kindness may do to the storyteller is it might make them suspicious. People with a history of trauma are suspicious of kindness. Why? Because more often than not, the person who abused us was also kind to us, and they likely used kindness to groom us and to bind our hearts to them. Therefore, our brains have made a linkage between kindness and danger. Kindness and danger have become connected in our brains because of our past experiences. Let me explain what this was like for me. I still remember Elizabeth, who was the first person to engage my story in depth. She lived a few hours away, and so much of our communication was via email. And I would send her little pieces, little snippets of my story, and she would email me back with such incredibly kind words. And after reading one of her emails where she engaged my story with such kindness, this is what I would do. After reading her email, and it was involuntary, okay? I would stare at the computer screen and I would say out loud 3 sentences. Who are you? Why are you so kind? And when will you leave? Do you see what's happening inside of me? I didn't know what to do with this woman's kindness. I didn't understand why she was even taking the time to listen to my story. I didn't understand why she cared about me. Who are you? Why are you so kind? And when will you leave? I was deeply suspicious of her kindness. Why? Because my abuser, one of them, my mother, was the kindest person in my world growing up. So my nervous system had paired kindness with abuse. Therefore, when someone was kind to me, I was immediately suspicious of them. Here's the implication. Here's the point. Engaging someone's story of trauma is fraught. It is so fraught. There is no way around this. But there is a way through all the shame and contempt that you trigger in the storyteller if you have the kindness to stay in it with them. So, principle number 2 of story engagement is that kindness will take you further than skill. Okay, that's enough for today. In part 2 of this series, I will share the other 5 principles of story engagement. And then in parts 3 and 4, we will look at the tactics of engaging someone's story. Remember to consider supporting the podcast financially if it has been helpful to you. And thank you so much for listening to today's episode.